The beacon had been broadcasting for 11 days before Cole Hartley decided to do something about it. Cole worked at Outpost Neva 7, a small relay station sitting at the edge of a region of space that most people in the Galactic Cooperative had long since stopped caring about. The Valen expanse was empty. Everyone knew that. No ships came through it. No civilization had ever been recorded there. The charts listed it as dead space, and the senior officers at the station treated it that way, something to be ignored, like background noise in an old building. But Cole was not a man who ignored things easily. He was 29 years old, with tired eyes and a habit of staying at his communications desk long after his shift ended. He was not ambitious in the way that made people want promotions. He was just careful. He liked to understand things fully before moving on from them. His commanding officer, a Grethian named Vasak, said this about him often, sometimes as a compliment, sometimes not. The beacon had first appeared on Cole's secondary monitor on a Tuesday morning. It was faint, steady, and completely automatic. A machine sending the same short message into the dark, over and over, with no sign that anything alive was behind it. Most of the other officers on the station had noted it, shrugged, and moved on. Dead relay buoys drifted through the outer corridors all the time. Ships broke down. Equipment failed. It was not unusual for old signals to echo through space for years after the vessel that created them had gone dark. Cole had initially thought the same thing. But on day 3, something bothered him. The signal was too clean. Old buoys degraded. Their transmissions became uneven, stretched, full of small errors that built up over time the way rust builds on metal. This signal was not like that. It was precise. It was measured. It was the kind of signal produced by something that was being maintained. He ran it through the first decoding filter. Static. He ran it through the second. More static. He ran it through a third filter, an old one, built for legacy frequencies, the kind used by ships and systems that predated the first contact era between humanity and the Galactic Cooperative. It was the sort of filter that most stations kept installed but never used, like a fire extinguisher in a room where no one expected a fire. The third filter returned a result. Cole sat very still for a moment. The station hummed around him. Through the small viewport above his desk, a faint scattering of stars sat against the black. He looked at the result on his screen and read it again, more slowly this time, to be certain he had not made a mistake. It was a human emergency frequency. Pre-expansion era. Not used for over 60 years. He cross-referenced it against the Deep Registry Archive, a massive database of every Earth vessel ever launched, going back to the earliest days of human spaceflight. The search took less than 10 seconds. The result that came back made his stomach go cold in a way he could not immediately explain. The frequency matched the colony ship Ardent Dawn. Registered out of Cape Canaveral, Earth. Launched in the year 2041. Crew and passenger count, 412 people. Mission, long-range colonization attempt toward the outer edge of the Kepler Transit Corridor. Status, presumed lost. All contact had been cut off shortly after the ship crossed into the deep corridor. No distress signal had ever been received. No wreckage had ever been found. The Ardent Dawn had simply gone out into the dark and never come back. That had been 83 years ago. Cole pushed back from his desk slowly. He looked at the screen for a long time. Outside, the Valen expanse stretched on in silence, enormous and dark and, apparently, not quite as empty as everyone had always believed. He thought about what to do. The correct thing, the procedure, was to log the signal through the standard cooperative channel, flag it for the duty officer, and let the system handle it. That was how things worked at Outpost Neva 7. Small station, small staff, everything run through proper channels. He did not do that. Instead, he reached for his personal communicator and called Dr. Nora Vance. Nora was the station's xenobiology analyst, technically a science officer, practically the only person on the station Cole trusted to think clearly about something unexpected. She was 36, sharp, and had a low tolerance for dramatic behavior, which Cole respected because he was not a dramatic person. She answered his call on the second tone, sounding mildly annoyed. She was eating. He could hear it. He told her what he had found. He kept it short and factual, which was the only way he knew how to tell things. There was a pause on her end. 3 seconds, maybe 4. "Send me everything," she said. Her voice had changed. The mild annoyance was gone. "And Cole, do not put this through the standard log yet. Not until we look at it properly." He agreed. It took Nora 11 minutes to get to the communications bay. When she arrived, she was still holding her food container, but she had stopped eating. She stood beside Cole and looked at the data on his screen without speaking for a while. The location of the signal was the first thing she focused on. She pulled up a navigational overlay and traced the beacon's origin point against the Ardent Dawn's last known trajectory. She did it twice. Then she put the food container down on the edge of the desk and forgot about it entirely. "That does not work," she said quietly. "No," Cole agreed. For the Ardent Dawn to be where the signal said it was, the ship would have needed to travel nearly 4 times the maximum range its original drive system allowed. Even if it had never stopped, never slowed, never done anything except push forward at full power every single day for 83 years, the numbers did not add up. Not with the engine technology available in 2041. Not even close. Unless something had changed. Nora pulled up the signal again and began running her own analysis. She was more thorough than Cole, slower and more systematic, checking each layer of the transmission the way a doctor checks a patient, carefully, looking for things that were not immediately obvious. She found something in the subsonic layer, buried beneath the main carrier tone. It was faint. Easy to miss. But when she isolated it and filtered it through an amplification process, it became clear. Voices. Human voices, too fragmented to understand, too broken up by distance and interference to form any clear sentences. But unmistakably human. And beneath the voices, steady and low, a mechanical rhythm that did not match any drive signature in the cooperative's database, not human, not Grecian, not any of the 31 registered species. Something new. Something that had never been catalogued before. The two of them looked at each other across the desk. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The station hummed. The stars outside sat still. Then Cole spoke. "Someone on that ship is still alive," he said. "And whatever they have been doing out there for 83 years, they have not been sitting still." Nora nodded once. She was already reaching for the communicator to send a private message to an old contact of hers, a retired admiral named Glenn Pruitt, who had spent 4 decades quietly following up on unconfirmed human signals in the outer corridors, the kind of man who would know exactly what this meant and exactly what needed to happen next. She did not use the standard channel. She used a private cipher. The Valen expanse stretched out beyond the viewport, dark and patient, holding its secret a little while longer. Glenn Pruitt's reply came back in less than an hour. Nora had not expected it so fast. She had sent the message carefully, keeping it short, making sure the words were neutral enough that anyone intercepting it would not understand what she was actually saying. Glenn was old and experienced and careful in the same way Cole was careful, the kind of careful that came from spending decades in situations where small mistakes had large consequences. His reply was 4 sentences long. "Do not log this through cooperative command. Do not discuss it on open channels. Keep the beacon locked behind your private cipher. I am already on my way." Nora read it twice. Then she set the message to auto-delete and turned back to her workstation. Cole was still at his desk. He had not gone off shift. He had pulled up everything the cooperative archives contained on the Ardent Dawn, the original mission brief, the crew manifest, the technical specs for the ship, the short and unhelpful incident report filed when contact was lost in 2041. He had spread it all across his screens and was reading through it the way he read everything, slowly and completely, refusing to skip anything. Nora sat down beside him and started doing the same. The Ardent Dawn had been a mid-sized colony vessel, built for a one-way journey. The people who boarded it in 2041 were not going somewhere and coming back. They were going somewhere and staying. 412 of them, engineers, doctors, farmers, teachers, a handful of scientists, and a lot of ordinary people who had decided that the life waiting for them on Earth was less interesting than the unknown waiting somewhere else. They had signed on for a hard journey to a distant world, with no guarantee of what they would find there and no plan to ever return. Contact had been lost 14 months into the journey. No distress signal. No final transmission. The ship had simply gone quiet, the way a candle goes quiet when the flame goes out. The cooperative had conducted a limited search, limited because the Ardent Dawn had been a human vessel and this had happened before humanity joined the cooperative, before there were protocols for that kind of thing, and found nothing. The case had been closed. The names had been added to a registry of the lost. And the galaxy had moved on. Except apparently the Ardent Dawn had not. Cole found something interesting in the technical specs. He pointed it out to Nora without comment, just put his finger on the screen and waited for her to see it. The ship's original drive had a listed maximum range of approximately 4 light-years. Maybe 5, in ideal conditions, with full fuel reserves and no cargo weight. The distance between the Ardent Dawn's last known position and the point where the beacon was currently transmitting was just over 14 light-years. Not 4. 14. They could not have gotten there with the original engine, Cole said. No, Nora agreed. They could not have. She pulled up the subsonic layer of the signal again and played the mechanical rhythm through the speakers at low volume. It filled the communications bay, a deep, regular pulse, not quite like anything she had heard before. She had spent 14 years cataloging the technology of non-human species, learning the signatures of their engines and reactors and communication systems the way a musician learns scales, until the sounds became a language she understood automatically. She did not understand this sound. It was not in her mental catalog. It was not in the cooperative's database. It was something that had never been formally recorded or studied or named. Which meant it had been built by people who were not connected to the cooperative, not drawing on any shared body of knowledge, not receiving guidance from any outside source. It had been built by a crew of 400 people on a ship in the dark. Over 80 years. From nothing. Nora sat back in her chair and thought about what that actually meant. Not the physics of it, she would deal with the physics later, but the human reality of it. The people who had originally boarded the Ardent Dawn were all dead now. Their children were probably dead too. The people alive on that ship, if people were alive on that ship, were the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of the original crew. They had been born in the dark. They had grown up in the dark. They had learned everything they knew from the people around them, with no schools, no libraries, no universities, no access to the broader galaxy's accumulated knowledge. And they had invented a new kind of engine. Cole was looking at her. He had the expression he wore when he had already thought through something and was waiting for the other person to catch up. How? She said. It was not really a question she expected him to answer. I do not know, he said. But they did. Glenn Pruitt arrived at Outpost Neva, 7:19 hours after he sent his reply. He came in on a small, unmarked courier ship, the kind that did not show up prominently on transit logs, the kind that a retired admiral with 40 years of experience in sensitive diplomatic work would know how to obtain quietly. He docked at the secondary bay, which Nora had prepared and then kept empty by logging a minor maintenance issue in the bay's system. He was 71 years old, with silver hair cut short and the kind of posture that did not bend even when everything else was uncertain. He had spent his career in rooms where the stakes were very high and the margin for error was very small, and it showed in the way he moved and the way he spoke, measured, unhurried, like a man who had learned that rushing almost always made things worse. He reviewed everything Cole and Nora had compiled. He did not rush through it. He asked 3 questions, short, direct, the kind that cut to the center of something immediately, and then went quiet for nearly 4 minutes. Cole and Nora let him be quiet. They had both figured out by now that Glenn Pruitt's silences were not empty. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. We need to go to them, he said. Not send a probe. Not file a report. Not notify cooperative command. We go, and we see them face to face, because whatever is on that ship is not the kind of thing you want the cooperative's bureaucracy touching before you understand what it is. What do you think it is? Nora asked. Glenn looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the subsonic rhythm still playing softly through the bay speakers. I think it is something the galaxy has not seen before, he said. And I think if the wrong people hear about it first, a lot of things are going to go very badly for those 400 people who have been out there alone for 80 years. Cole was already standing up. He had, it turned out, already filed the necessary paperwork to take the courier on a survey run. Quietly. Without being asked. Glenn looked at him with something that was almost a smile. Good, the old man said. Let us go. Cole piloted the courier himself. It was a 9-hour journey from Outpost Neva, 7 to the point in the Valen expanse where the beacon was transmitting. 9 hours of empty space, no traffic, no other signals, nothing on the long-range scanner except the steady pulse of the beacon getting slowly stronger as they moved toward it. Glenn sat in the co-pilot seat and read through the Ardent Dawn's original mission files on a handheld screen. Nora sat in the back, looking at the mechanical rhythm from the subsonic layer, running it through every analysis tool she had access to, trying to understand what she was hearing. She could not figure it out. The physics kept almost making sense, and then breaking down at the last step. It was like reading a word in a language you mostly knew, recognizing almost every part of it, and still not being able to say what it meant. 6 hours in, the long-range scanner picked up the first trace of the ship. It was a mass reading, something large, much larger than the beacon alone would suggest. Cole zoomed in on it and increased the scanner resolution. The trace sharpened. Then sharpened again. Then resolved into a shape. All three of them went quiet. Cole had pulled up the original schematics of the Ardent Dawn before the journey and studied them carefully, so he would know what to look for. A colony vessel from 2041 was a specific kind of thing, long and cylindrical, not elegant, built for function rather than appearance. Habitation rings stacked in a row along a central spine. Cargo bays clustered near the rear. Engine assembly at the back, a simple design for a simple purpose. The whole thing shaped like a very long, slightly irregular tube. What was on the scanner was not a tube. It was enormous. The original hull was still somewhere in there. Cole could trace its outline if he looked carefully, could pick out the faint ghost of the original shape buried inside everything that had been added to it. But added to it was almost not a strong enough phrase for what he was seeing. The ship had been transformed from the outside in and from the inside out, the way a tree is transformed when it grows, not by replacing what was there but by building on it, layer after layer, year after year, until the original thing was nearly invisible beneath everything new. There were structures extending from the upper hull that looked like they had been built from raw asteroid ore, shaped roughly but solidly, bolted to the original frame with a directness that said the people who built them cared more about whether it worked than whether it looked good. There were communication arrays spread along the port side, large, intricate, clearly capable of listening across enormous distances. There were observation blisters studding the habitation section, small transparent domes pressed outward from the hull, dozens of them, giving the inside of the ship a view of the outside that the original design had never provided. And at the rear, where the original engine assembly had once been, there was something else entirely. The new drive was impossible to look at without wanting to understand it immediately. It was a dense arrangement of rings and cores, asymmetric in a way that seemed deliberate rather than accidental, built around a central structure that pulsed with a slow, deep light. Even through the courier's hull, Cole could feel something, a low vibration in the base of his spine, something between sound and pressure, the physical sensation of an engine working in a way no engine he had ever been near had worked before. The mechanical rhythm from the subsonic layer was no longer just a sound on Nora's analysis screen. It was here. It was real. It was enormous. Hailing frequency, Glenn said. His voice was perfectly steady. Cole opened the channel. He kept the transmission simple, just the standard human greeting code, the same short sequence of tones that had been used since the early days of deep space travel, recognizable to any human system anywhere. The response came back in less than 30 seconds. Not a tone. Not an automated acknowledgement. A voice. Clear, calm, unhurried. No static. No distortion. The voice of someone who had been expecting a call and was not surprised it had come. This is the Ardent Dawn. We have been waiting for someone to come. We are glad it was humans first. The three of them sat with that for a moment. Then Glenn leaned toward the mic. This is Glenn Pruitt, retired Admiral, Earth Diaspora Council. We are requesting permission to dock. A pause. Brief, comfortable, not nervous. Permission granted. Bay 4, port side. We will guide you in. The docking process took 20 minutes. The bay on the Ardent Dawn was larger than Cole had expected and better equipped than it had any right to be, given what it had been built from. The lights inside were warm. The air that came through the seal when the doors opened was clean and carried a faint smell of something growing, plants, Cole realized. They had plants. Ruth Calloway was waiting for them on the other side of the airlock. She was 54 years old, sturdy and calm, with dark eyes that measured everything quickly and a stillness about her that was not coldness. She was wearing a plain gray coverall, worn smooth at the elbows and knees from long use, with a small patch on the left shoulder that Cole did not immediately recognize, a circular design, hand-stitched, showing a ship traveling across a field of stars. She had never seen Earth. She had been born on this ship, grown up on this ship, spent every day of her life in the dark between the stars. And she stood in the doorway of her home and looked at the three people who had come to find her the way someone looks at a thing they have been waiting a long time for. "Welcome aboard the Ardent Dawn," she said. "We have a great deal to show you." Ruth Calloway walked them through the ship for nearly 3 hours. She was a good guide, not because she performed for them or made speeches, but because she simply knew everything. Every corridor, every room, every system, every modification, every piece of the ship that had been fixed or changed or built from nothing over the course of 83 years. She spoke about all of it the way someone speaks about a house they grew up in, with the easy, quiet knowledge of a person who has never had to explain their home to themselves. There were 269 people living on the Ardent Dawn. The original 412 had not all survived the first 20 years. Ruth told them this without drama, in the same calm voice she used for everything. There had been equipment failures in the early years, when the crew was still learning how to maintain a ship with no outside support, no spare parts from any manufacturer, no ability to call for help. A water processor had failed during what the crew called the second winter, not a real winter, since there were no seasons in space, but a period of severe rationing that lasted 8 months and left its mark on the community's memory for generations afterward. A fire in the lower agriculture ring had killed 6 people and destroyed a large portion of the food supply. A pressure seal had failed quietly over the course of several months before anyone detected it, and by the time it was found, 3 people in that section had died from slow exposure. Each time something broke, the survivors had fixed it. Each time they could not fix it with what they had figured out how to make what they needed. Slowly, painfully, with a lot of failure before the successes, they had learned to be the engineers and doctors and farmers and builders that the ship required. And they had passed that knowledge to their children, who had passed it to their children, who had passed it forward again. The hydroponic gardens took up 3 full sections of the habitation ring. Cole walked through them and said nothing, just looked. Row after row of plants growing under warm artificial light, the air thick and green smelling, the systems that fed and watered and lit them running with a steady, confident precision. These were not desperate little survival crops. These were well-managed, abundant, and clearly the work of people who had been doing this for a very long time. The school was a single large room near the center of the ship. The walls were covered with handwritten notes and diagrams, star charts and mathematical proofs, drawings of machine parts and botanical sketches and historical timelines that stretched across long sheets of paper. Books, real physical books, some of them clearly originals brought from Earth in 2041, others clearly copies made by hand on the ship, were stacked on shelves along every wall. A class was in session when they passed. Ruth paused in the doorway so they could look. A man of about 40 stood at the front, talking through a diagram of the drive assembly on a large board. The 8 children watching him ranged from about 8 years old to about 15. They were paying complete attention. Nora looked at the diagram for a moment and then looked away, because it made the cold feeling behind her sternum come back. The drive was the thing she kept returning to. Ruth brought them to the engineering section eventually, to a long room that ran along the rear of the ship and gave a direct view through reinforced transparent panels of the engine assembly at work. Up close, the deep vibration Cole had felt through the courier's hull was stronger, not uncomfortable, but present, a constant low reminder that something was working here in a way that was different from anything else. The drive had been theorized by Ruth's father, Owen Calloway, who had died 12 years ago at the age of 79 and was remembered on the ship the way the community remembered all its important dead, with a small handmade memorial in the common area and his name written on the wall of the school alongside the other people who had built the most important things. Owen had been a mechanical engineer when he boarded the Ardent Dawn as a young man. He had spent the first 20 years of the journey doing what the ship needed: repairs, maintenance, jury-rigging solutions to problems that the original designers had not anticipated. But in his off hours, he had been working on something else. He had been thinking about the drive. The original engine could not get them where they needed to go. Everyone on the ship knew this. The destination world in the Kepler corridor was beyond its range, had always been beyond its range. The ship had been pushed off course in the early years by a gravitational anomaly that the mission planners had not accounted for, and after that, the original destination was no longer reachable. They were on a long curve through empty space with no clear endpoint. Owen had decided to solve that problem. He had started with what he knew and worked outward from there, thinking through the physics the way you think through a very complicated puzzle, taking it apart piece by piece. He had written everything down. Pages and pages of calculations, spread across years of notebooks, filled with false starts and corrections and moments where everything had to be reconsidered from the beginning. His daughter had continued his work. His daughter's students had continued it after her. 3 generations of engineers, all of them self-taught, all of them building on what the person before them had figured out, all of them pushing the same idea forward by small steps until the steps added up to something real. The drive had been successfully tested for the first time 14 years ago. Ruth had been there for the test. She had been 40 years old and had spent most of her life reading her father's notebooks. "Why did you send the beacon now?" Glenn asked. They were standing in the engineering room, the quiet pulse of the drive filling the air around them. Ruth considered the question for a moment, as if she wanted to answer it correctly rather than quickly. "Because we were ready," she said. "We did not want to come back to the cooperative as people who needed saving. We needed to come back as people who had something to offer. It took 80 years to become that. We took the time we needed." Glenn said nothing. He was looking through the transparent panel at the drive assembly, at the rings and cores turning slowly in the dark, doing something that no institution in the cooperative had managed to figure out on its own. "The cooperative will want this," he said. Quiet. Factual. Not unkind. "We know," Ruth said. "That is why we are talking to you first." The emergency session of the Galactic Cooperative Senior Council was called 6 days after Glenn Pruitt sent his formal notification through proper diplomatic channels. Those 6 days had not been idle. Glenn had spent them in careful, private conversation with Ruth Calloway, working out terms, making sure everything was in order before the larger world found out what was sitting in the dark at the edge of the Valen expanse. Nora had spent them running analysis after analysis on the drive data Ruth had shared, filling notebook after notebook with observations she could barely process fast enough to write down. Cole had spent most of them helping the Ardent Dawn's crew with a list of small repairs they had been unable to complete, not because they lacked the skill, but because they lacked certain raw materials. He had flown back to Outpost Neva 7 twice, quietly, and returned both times with supplies. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. He just did it. Valen Station was the Galactic Cooperative's main diplomatic hub, a large, old facility that sat at the junction of 3 major transit routes and had been hosting interspecies negotiations for over 200 years. Its council chamber was a wide, circular room with raised seating arranged in rings around a central floor, designed so that every delegation could see every other delegation and no species was seated above or below any other. 31 species filled those seats on the morning of the session. The Grethian delegation arrived first. High Arbiter Vosnarine led them in, a tall figure with 4 horizontal eyes and the formal bearing of someone who had presided over more of these sessions than anyone else in the room. The Grethians took the central raised seats they traditionally occupied as the cooperative's oldest administrative members, settling into place with the practiced ease of a species that had been doing this for a very long time. The Savari came next. They were tall and narrow, with translucent sensory membranes draped across their upper bodies like long scarves, and they moved with the slow, deliberate grace of creatures who had learned centuries ago that rushing almost never accomplished anything useful. They took their seats quietly. Then came the Keel, the Andrith, the pallid communes of the Fetch system, the 3-formed Vessen, the deep-sea Uruk attending through their standard translation array. Species after species, filling the room, representatives of civilizations that had been navigating space for hundreds of years before humanity had its first industrial revolution. Glenn stood at the central podium. Cole and Nora stood behind him. Ruth Calloway stood beside him. She was wearing the same worn gray coverall she had worn aboard the Ardent Dawn. She had declined the offer of cooperative-issue clothing, not rudely, just with the quiet certainty of someone who did not feel any need to dress differently for the occasion. The small hand-stitched patch on her left shoulder was visible to anyone in the room who looked closely enough. The presentation lasted 40 minutes. Glenn walked through it all, the history of the Ardent Dawn, the 83-year silence, the self-developed drive, the communication arrays, the generation-by-generation survival and growth of a community that the galaxy had written off as dead. Visual documentation played on the large central screens, the ship as it looked now, the drive assembly, the school with its handwritten walls, the hydroponic gardens. Nobody interrupted. In a chamber of 31 species, with dozens of delegates present, that was unusual. The silence was not empty, it had weight, the weight of many different minds working through the same information at the same time. When the presentation ended, the silence held for a moment longer. Then High Arbiter Vosnarine spoke. The Arbiter's voice was low and even, the voice of someone asking a question they already understood was important. You are saying that a human vessel, without cooperative resources or assistance of any kind, developed a compression expansion drive independently. That is correct, Glenn said. And you are saying this drive is functional. Not theoretical. Not experimental. Functional. The Ardent Dawn traveled 14 light-years in 41 days, Glenn said. Yes. It is functional. The silence that came after this was different from the silence before. It was the silence of very old, very experienced entities absorbing a piece of information that had changed something they thought they understood. The Savari representative, whose name, in the closest translation available, meant something like deep current, leaned forward. The Savari were among the oldest spacefaring species in the cooperative, and they did not lean forward for small things. The drive, deep current said. The membrane across their shoulders shifted slowly. You are offering to share this technology with the cooperative. Ruth Calloway answered before Glenn could. Her voice was calm. Not loud. Not aggressive. Completely certain. We are offering to license it, she said. Under terms that provide appropriate compensation to the Ardent Dawn community, full cooperative citizenship with equal standing for all 269 members of our crew, and formal legal recognition of our independent development rights. We are not giving anything away. We are entering into an agreement. Humans have been entering into agreements for a very long time. We know how it works. The chamber erupted. Not into chaos, these were experienced diplomats, all of them, trained to manage their reactions in public. But the eruption was real, 17 languages breaking out across 24 communication frequencies simultaneously, delegate after delegate turning to consult with their own teams, the translation arrays working at full capacity to keep up with the sudden flood of words. Nora, standing behind Glenn, watched Ruth during all of it. Ruth did not move. She stood at the center of the floor while 31 species reacted around her, her hands at her sides, her expression quiet and patient. She had grown up on a ship in the dark with 200 other people, learning everything from scratch, building a life from nothing in a place where no one was coming to help. Standing in a room full of noise while powerful people decided what to do about her was, by comparison, an easy thing to wade through. Nora watched the High Arbiter's face. The Grethians had 4 eyes arranged in a horizontal band, and all 4 of them were fixed on Ruth with an expression that Nora, after 14 years of studying non-human faces, could only describe as recognition, the look of an old species seeing something new and understanding, without needing it explained, that the thing it was seeing mattered. Cole leaned close to Nora's ear. Did we just watch humanity renegotiate its place in the galaxy? He said quietly. Nora shook her head. No, she said. We watched one woman from a ship that should have been dead for 80 years do it. We were just here to open the door. Outside the great viewports of Valen Station, the stars held their ancient positions, as they always had, indifferent to everything happening beneath them. But something had changed in the space between them, something that could not be unchanged, something quiet and solid and entirely the work of 269 people who had decided, a very long time ago, that the dark was not something to be afraid of. It was something to be built in.